In a valley cupped between forgotten hills, a shadow lived. It had a name, Magnus, but names are for things you wish to call to you, and no one in the village ever wished for Magnus. He was a bull of impossible size, a creature of mythic fury, his hide the color of a thundercloud and his horns like twin daggers of polished bone. The fence around his pasture wasn't just wood and wire, it was a border treaty, a fragile line drawn between the village's fragile peace and the violent chaos that churned within him. His rage was a physical thing, a tremor in the soil, a hot breath that carried on the wind. When he charged the fence, the impact was not a thud, but a crack of thunder that sent children scurrying indoors and made men grip their tools a little tighter. He was more than an animal. He was an affliction, a living embodiment of the village's anxieties, a problem for which the only solution seemed to be an eventual, grim finality. But a final act of violence felt like a surrender to the very darkness he represented. And so, he remained, a king in a prison of his own making, feared, hated, and profoundly alone. Into this world of shouted warnings and held breath lived a silence. Her name was Elara, a girl of 10 years, with eyes that held the deep, still water calm of a forest pool. Elara's world was one without sound. She had been born into a quiet so complete it was its own language, a landscape of vibrations, of shifting light, of feelings that moved through a room like currents. To the village, she was a tragedy, wrapped in innocence, a beautiful broken bird. They loved her with a gentle pity, speaking to her with exaggerated gestures she didn't need, their voices loud, as if the volume alone could breach the wall of her silence. They saw her as fragile, a soul to be protected from a world she could not fully grasp. What they failed to understand was that in her silence, Elara heard more than any of them. She heard the secret grief of a weeping willow, the unspoken worry in her father's hands, and the roaring, desperate loneliness of the bull named Magnus. One sweltering afternoon, a farmhand, new to the area and heedless of the warnings, drove a cart too close to the fence. Magnus exploded. He was not an animal. He was a force of nature, a landslide of muscle and fury. He hit the fence with a sound that splintered wood and reason, his bellow a raw, guttural tear in the fabric of the afternoon. The farmhand scrambled away, pale and trembling. The village watched from a safe distance, another story of Magnus's terror added to the ledger. But Elara, watching from her window, saw something else. She saw not just rage, but a desperate, terrifying panic, a scream that had no words. And in that moment, a quiet decision took root in her silent world, a decision that would defy every warning she had ever been given and rewrite the story of the beast in the pasture. A pull, soft but insistent as the tide, drew Elara from her home. It was a current of feeling she had felt before, a low hum of sorrow that vibrated through the soles of her feet, a silent call from the pasture. While her mother, Maria, was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour and her mind on the evening meal, Elara slipped out the back door. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked earth and the distant metallic tang of fear that always clung to the air near Magnus's field. To the rest of the village, that field was a no-man's land, a place to be hurried past. To Elara, it was a destination. She walked not with the bravado of a challenger, nor the foolishness of the naive, but with the quiet purpose of a pilgrim. Her small feet made little sound on the dusty path. She saw the world in a way no one else did. The frantic dance of a butterfly was a symphony of color. The sway of the tall grass was a whispered conversation. She was an observer of a world that existed just beneath the noise, and the loudest silent thing she had ever encountered was the heart of the beast in the field. As she drew closer, she could feel him. It wasn't just the sight of his massive form, a dark mountain against the green, but the energy that rolled off him in waves, a chaotic storm of fury, frustration, and a deep, aching solitude. He was pacing, a restless, thunderous patrol along the fence line. His head was low, his breath pluming in the humid air like smoke. He was a prisoner, and the fence was the cage that contained his body, but his own rage was the cage that contained his soul. Alara didn't hesitate. She didn't approach the gate or the weakened posts. She found a spot beneath a gnarled oak tree, its roots twisting from the earth like sleeping serpents, and she simply sat. She tucked her legs beneath her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't stare at him as a curiosity or a threat. She just settled into her own silence and offered it to him, a pool of stillness beside his raging ocean. At first, he didn't notice her. Then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, and he stopped. His head snapped up. The storm in him gathered force. He let out a low, rumbling snort, a warning that could curdle milk. He pawed the ground, sending clumps of turf flying. This was the prelude to the charge, the ritual of terror the village knew so well. Any other person would have screamed, run, fainted. Alara did none of these things. She remained, a small, unmoving island of calm. The sight of her broke his script. He expected fear. He expected frantic, jerky movements, high-pitched sounds of panic. Her stillness was an anomaly, a question he didn't know how to answer. The rage in his eyes, hot and red, began to cool into something else, confusion. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. The snorting subsided. He watched her, his massive head cocked, the deep brown of his eyes seeming to absorb her tranquility. It was then that her father, Matteo, realized she was gone. A cold spike of terror lanced through him. He called her name, a useless gesture that only amplified his panic. He ran outside, his eyes scanning the lane, and then he saw her. A tiny figure sitting impossibly close to the fence of the monster. His heart stopped. He and two other men began to run, their minds filled with a single, horrifying image. But as they got closer, they slowed, then stopped, frozen by the scene before them. The beast, the devil, the killer bull, was standing 20 feet from the silent girl, perfectly still, his rage extinguished, as if by a gentle rain. He was just watching her. And for the first time in years, the air around Magnus's pasture was not filled with terror, but with a profound and baffling silence. Matteo's hands were shaking as he pulled Ilara away from the fence. His voice, when it came, was a choked, ragged thing, a sound torn between relief and a fury born of absolute terror. "What were you thinking?" he signed, his movements sharp and frantic, a stark contrast to the calm she had just inhabited. "He could have killed you. Ilara, he is a monster." She looked at her father, at the fear that twisted his face into a mask she barely recognized, and she tried to explain. She pressed her small hand to her own chest, then held it out towards the pasture, her fingers spread wide, trying to convey a feeling, a vibration, a vast and cavernous loneliness she had felt from the bull. She then curled her own body into a small, tight ball and mimicked a silent scream, her face a mask of anguish. "He is not angry," her gesture said. "He is afraid. He is alone." But Matteo saw only a child's fantasy, a dangerous delusion that had nearly cost her everything. He shook his head, pulling her into an embrace that was more like a vice. He was holding on to his daughter, but also holding on to the fear that had defined the village's relationship with Magnus for years. Later that evening, Lorenzo, the village elder, came to their small home. His face, a roadmap of worry and wisdom, was grim. He sat at their table, his gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea, and he spoke in low, serious tones. "It was a fluke, Matteo," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "A one-time miracle. The beast was confused, that is all. You cannot let her go back there." "It is tempting fate." Lorenzo spoke of the bull's history, the farmer he had gored years ago, the other animals he had brutalized. He painted a picture of an unredeemable creature, a genetic mistake. "A beast is a beast," he concluded, the words landing with the finality of a stone. "You cannot love the rage out of it." The next day, Matteo and 3 other men were at the pasture, reinforcing the fence. They hammered in new posts, strung new wire, their movements filled with a grim purpose. The fence wasn't just being repaired, it was being fortified, made higher, stronger. It was a physical manifestation of their denial, a wall against the impossible thing they had witnessed. It was a barrier meant to protect Elara from the bull, but in its shadow, it became a symbol of all the fences that stood between them, the fence between spoken words and silent feelings, the fence between fear and understanding, the fence between Elara and the one creature who seemed to understand her own silent language. Have you ever tried to explain a feeling so deep it has no words? A truth you feel in your bones, while everyone around you calls you a fool, a child, or a dreamer. Elara sat on her porch, watching them work, a profound ache settling in her chest. They were building a wall to keep a monster in, but she knew they were also walling a friend out, sealing him inside his own terrible isolation, and in doing so, they were walling her out too. She drew in the dirt with a stick, a large, powerful shape, and a small one beside it, not separated by a line, but together. No one saw it. They were too busy building their fence. The newly fortified fence loomed in the afternoon sun, a declaration of the village's fear. But fear is a wall, and walls are meant to be navigated. Elara's quiet determination, a force the village had always mistaken for passivity, was now a river, carving its own path through stone. Her father had forbidden her from going near the pasture. "Stay away from him, Elara. Promise me." Matteo had signed, his face etched with a plea she could not deny. She had nodded, a gesture of compliance, but a promise made in fear is a fragile thing. Her promise was not to her father, but to the silent, lonely call she felt from the field. And so, a ritual began. Every afternoon, when the sun was high and her father was in the fields, she would find her way back to her spot beneath the gnarled oak. She kept a respectful distance from the new, formidable fence, honoring the letter of her father's law, if not its spirit. She brought no offerings, no food to tame him, no toys to distract him. She brought only herself. She would sit for an hour, sometimes two, her book of fairy tales open but unread in her lap. She was not there to do anything. She was simply there to be, to share the vast, empty space of her silence, hoping it might dilute the crowded, noisy chaos of his. At first, Magnus was agitated by her presence. He would pace the far side of the pasture, a dark storm cloud of restless energy. He saw her, he knew she was there, but the memory of the men, the hammers, the violation of his space, had rekindled his mistrust. The village watched her. From their windows, from the edges of their own properties, they saw the small girl sitting alone near the monster's cage. The whispers followed her like a shadow. "Foolish child. Matteo should lock her in her room. She's going to get herself killed." Yet, they couldn't look away. Her quiet defiance was a spectacle, a silent rebellion against the fear that had ruled them all for so long. But day by day, a change began, as subtle as the turning of a season. The bull's frantic pacing slowed. He started to graze a little closer to her side of the field each afternoon. The angry, agitated lashing of his tail softened into a slow, rhythmic swish. One afternoon, instead of pacing, he simply lay down. He chose a spot directly in her line of sight, his massive body sinking into the cool grass, and he watched her. The rage that had always burned in his eyes like hot coals seemed to dim, banked into a low, watchful ember. He started to wait for her. Around 3 o'clock, his great head would lift, his gaze fixed on the path she always took. He would see her small form appear in the distance, and a strange stillness would settle over him. He was no longer a monster in a cage. He was a creature waiting for his friend. The village whispers began to change, the sharp edges of condemnation softening into the rounded vowels of wonder. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they could not deny it. The girl who could not hear was listening to a beast no one else could understand, and the beast who roared with rage was learning the language of silence. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air heavy and expectant. The village had been preparing for the storm, securing shutters, bringing animals into their barns. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Then, the breath was released in a torrent. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the very heavens, a noise that even Elara could feel, a deep, jarring vibration in her bones. In the heart of the maelstrom, a sound unlike the thunder ripped through the air, the sharp, sickening crack of ancient wood. An old oak, at the edge of Magnus's pasture, weakened by age and battered by the gale, had finally surrendered. A massive limb, thick as a man's waist, had torn away and crashed directly onto the fence, splintering posts and snapping wire like thread. The barrier was broken. Panic, cold and immediate, flooded the village laneways. It was a terror faster than the flash flood beginning to swell in the ditches. The bull! The bull is loose! The cry was snatched up by the wind, a chorus of pure fear. Men burst from their homes, their faces pale in the strobing lightning. They grabbed what they could, pitchforks from barns, heavy logging axes from woodsheds. They were not farmers anymore. They were a desperate militia, preparing to face the monster they had caged, now unleashed and surely driven mad by the storm's fury. They saw a rampaging beast, a whirlwind of horns and hooves, thundering through their streets, goring, trampling, destroying. This was the moment they had always dreaded. But before their clumsy, terrified defense could form, a small figure shot past them, a flash of yellow raincoat against the gray deluge. It was Ilara. "Ilara, no!" Her father screamed, his voice swallowed by the roaring wind, a sound she could not have heard even on the calmest of days. He started to run after her, but slipped and fell in the slick mud, his heart seizing with a fear more profound than any he had ever known. He watched, helpless, as his daughter ran not towards the chaos, but into the heart of it. She didn't run for the gaping hole in the fence, the gateway to a potential massacre. She ran to her spot, her place, to the gnarled, steadfast oak that had been their silent meeting ground. She reached it, soaked and breathless, and she sat down in the mud in the pouring rain. She sat, a tiny beacon of impossible calm, in the middle of a tempest. And Magnus, who had been charging wildly around his field, agitated by the crashing tree, the thunder, and the sudden, terrifying scent of freedom, saw her. His frenzy halted. The chaos within him, a mirror of the storm around him, met the immovable anchor of her presence. He stood for a moment, steam rising from his heaving flanks. The broken fence was there, an open door to the terrified world beyond. He looked at the gap, and then he looked at the girl, and he made a choice. He turned away from the promise of violent, unfettered freedom. He walked, not with a charge, but with a slow, deliberate gait, directly to the intact section of the fence where Ilara sat waiting. And there, with the world falling apart around them, the great and terrible bull lay down in the mud, tucked his legs beneath him, and rested his head on the ground, his eyes closed against the rain. He had chosen her. He had chosen her peace over his own freedom. The rain began to soften, the thunder retreating into a distant, grumbling complaint. In the storm's quiet aftermath, the world seemed newly washed, fragile and glistening. The men of the village stood frozen, their makeshift weapons hanging limply in their hands. The pitchforks and axes looked absurd now, relics of a fear that had just been proven baseless. They had prepared for a monster, but the creature before them, lying peacefully in the mud beside a small child, was something else entirely. They weren't looking at a beast, they were looking at a bond. Lorenzo, the elder, was the first to move. He walked forward slowly, his old boots squelching in the mud. He didn't carry a weapon, only the heavy weight of his own misjudgment. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting from the placid bull to the small, rain-soaked girl. His face, usually a mask of stern certainty, was slack with awe. He looked at Matteo, who had scrambled to his feet, his face a mess of mud and tear tracks. In a voice quiet enough for the whole village to hear in the sudden stillness, Lorenzo said, "We were wrong, Matteo. We were all so wrong." The words were an admission, an apology, and a benediction all in one. Matteo's heart, which had been a cold, tight knot of terror, finally released. The fear he had harbored for his daughter's safety, the fear that had made him angry and blind, melted away, replaced by a wave of pride so powerful it buckled his knees. He saw her then, truly saw her, not as his fragile, disobedient child, but as a force of nature in her own right, a hero whose courage was measured not in strength, but in stillness. He walked to her, his steps no longer frantic. He knelt in the mud beside her, unmindful of the cold and wet. He didn't speak, didn't sign. He simply sat with her, sharing her silence for the first time, and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. In that moment, he saw his own fear reflected in the calm pool of her eyes, and let it dissolve, choosing to mirror her peace instead. News of the storm and the miracle of the bull traveled faster than the receding floodwaters. It brought an unexpected visitor a few days later. Dr. Annalise, a veterinarian who had retired to a neighboring town. She was a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, who carried with her an air of quiet authority. She didn't come to gawk, but to observe. She spent an afternoon watching from a distance, as Alara sat with Magnus, the fence now repaired but a gate left respectfully unlatched. Annalise spoke to Matteo and Lorenzo, her voice calm and measured. "It's not magic," she explained softly, "though it certainly feels like it. Animals, especially ones who have been traumatized, are masters of reading intent. They feel our energy. Your fear, your aggression. Magnus felt that as a threat, so he responded with threat. "This little girl," she said, her eyes filled with warmth as she looked towards Alara. "She approaches with nothing but calm, quiet acceptance. She doesn't want anything from him. She is simply offering him a safe space. In her silence, he doesn't hear a threat. He feels peace. She didn't tame him. She gave him permission to stop fighting. She gave their miracle a name, not to diminish it, but to honor it, providing a framework of understanding that allowed their awe to settle into a new, profound respect. The gate to the pasture now swung on well-oiled hinges, no longer a barrier but an invitation. With the village's blessing, and her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder, Alara took her first steps into Magnus's world. The air inside the fence was different. It was thick with the scent of clover, damp earth, and the immense, living presence of the bull. The tension that hung in the air was not fear anymore, but a kind of sacred reverence. The villagers who had gathered to watch stood in silence, witnesses to a moment that felt bigger than all of them. Magnus was standing near the center of the field, a patient mountain. He watched her approach, his great head raised. He didn't move towards her, but waited, giving her the space to choose her path. Her small bare feet patted softly on the grass. She walked with that same unhurried calm, her heart a steady, gentle rhythm in her chest. She stopped a few feet from him, standing before the immense wall of his shoulder. For a long moment, they just existed in that space together, a silent question hanging in the air. Then, slowly, she raised her hand. Not to his head, with its formidable horns, a place of power and danger. She reached for his shoulder, for the solid, earthy core of him. Her small palm, soft and pink, made contact with his coarse, dark hide. She felt the texture, rougher than she imagined, and the incredible warmth radiating from him, a deep, furnace-like heat. Beneath her hand, she felt the tremble of 1,000 pounds of muscle, a power so vast it could shatter stone, yet here it was, perfectly still, surrendering to her touch. And then he did something that made a collective gasp ripple through the onlookers. He leaned into her hand. The great bull, the terror of the valley, shifted his immense weight, pressing gently against her small frame, a gesture of such profound trust and affection it was breathtaking. A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her father's cheek. It was a moment of complete catharsis, a silent agreement that passed between two souls who had found their other half in a world that had understood neither of them. Their days together settled into a comfortable, shared landscape of silence. Alara would spend her afternoons in the pasture, a small, vibrant flower, in the shadow of a gentle mountain. She would bring her books and read aloud to him, not with her voice, but with her presence, her back resting against his warm, solid flank, feeling the gentle rumble in his chest as he breathed. She would draw pictures of them in the dirt with a stick, or weave daisy chains that she would drape over his horns, which he wore with a placid dignity. He was no longer Magnus the Terror. he was just Magnus. Her Magnus. Her friend? Her confidant? Her unconventional protector? The redeemed villain had found his sanctuary, and the wounded healer had found her voice, not in sound, but in the powerful language of touch and trust. The pasture at the center of the village was no longer a place to be avoided, a symbol of contained danger. It had transformed into the village's heart, a living portrait of peace. The story of Ilara and Magnus became a local legend, a modern parable told in hushed, reverent tones. Travelers passing through would be directed to the field, not to see a monster, but to witness a miracle. People would stop their work to watch them, not with the old, familiar anxiety, but with a quiet sense of wonder that soothed their own hurried souls. The sight of the massive bull gently nudging the little girl's shoulder, or lying with his head in her lap as she stroked his broad face, had a calming effect on everyone. The frantic energy of the village seemed to slow down, the collective fear replaced by a gentler, more observant quiet. A different kind of listening began to take hold. Ilara herself was transformed in their eyes. She was no longer the tragic figure, the poor deaf girl. She was Ilara, the one who had spoken to the heart of a monster and found a friend. She was the keeper of their peace, the center of their new story. People started to approach her not with pity, but with a deep and abiding respect. They learned to communicate with her more patiently, to watch her hands, to read the expressive language of her face. They began to understand that listening was not something you did only with your ears. Her perceived weakness, her silence, had become their greatest teacher, their collective strength. She had taught them the power of presence, of seeing beyond the surface of things to the feeling that lay beneath. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and soft purples, the entire village seemed to pause. Matteo stood with Lorenzo at the edge of the pasture, watching Ilara and Magnus. The bull was lying down, and Ilara was resting beside him, her head pillowed on his massive side, fast asleep. The sunset, a spectacle of dramatic fading light, seemed to symbolize the change that had swept over them all. The violent, fearful reds and oranges of Magnus's old rage were giving way to the soft, gentle, and peaceful hues of lavender and rose. "She healed him," Lorenzo said, his voice thick with emotion. Matteo shook his head gently, a small smile on his face as he watched his daughter. "No," he replied softly. "I think they healed each other. The peace they had found was a fragile ecosystem, a perfect balance of trust and silence. They did not yet know that the greatest test of this newfound harmony was rolling towards them, a storm of a different kind, one made not of wind and rain, but of paper and greed." The outside world arrived on a Tuesday, not with a roar, but with the quiet crunch of expensive tires on the gravel road. It came in the form of two men in sharp city suits, carrying leather briefcases that seemed alien in the rustic landscape. They were developers, representatives of a corporation that had bought up a large tract of land that included, according to their neatly folded maps, the pasture where Magnus lived. They saw the valley not as a home, but as untapped potential, a future site for luxury holiday cabins, with a golf course where the pasture now stood. Their leader was a man named Mr. Harrison, a man with a polite smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He saw the world in terms of profit margins and liability risks. Matteo and Lorenzo met with them in the village hall, the air thick with the smell of old wood and new trouble. Harrison unrolled his blueprints, his voice smooth and professional as he outlined their plans. When Lorenzo explained, his voice trembling slightly, that the pasture was not just land, but the home of Magnus and the sanctuary of Ilara, Harrison's polite smile tightened. "I've read the file on this animal," he said, tapping a folder in his briefcase. "A history of aggression, an incident with a farmer, deemed a public danger years ago. Legally, he's a liability. Frankly, we'd be doing you a favor by having him removed." The word hung in the air, clinical and cruel. The village's miracle was, to this man, a problem to be euthanized. The men of the village tried to explain. They spoke of the change, of the storm, of Ilara. They told the story that had become their truth, their voices filled with a passion and conviction that felt clumsy against Harrison's corporate polish. He listened with a look of detached patience, the kind one gives to a rambling child. To him, it was a fairy tale, a quaint local delusion. "I understand this is an emotional issue for you," he said, his tone condescendingly gentle. "But we have permits, legal contracts, and a responsibility to our investors. The animal has to go." That's the reality. The conflict was stark and immovable. It was their lived, felt experience against his cold, documented logic, their miracle against his bottom line. For the second time, the village rallied to defend Magnus. But this was not a foe they could face with pitchforks or fences. This was an enemy armed with bureaucracy and disbelief. They stood at the gate of the pasture the next morning, a silent, human barrier. As Harrison and his team arrived with a local official and a stock trailer, it felt hopeless. Their words had failed. Their truth was being dismissed as folklore. It seemed the world of noise and paper was about to shatter their world of silence and peace. Words had been spent. Logic had been exhausted. The standoff at the pasture gate was a tense, silent war between two worlds. On one side stood the villagers, a human chain of desperate faith. On the other, Mr. Harrison, the official, and the grim reality of the stock trailer, its metal ramp waiting like an open maw. The air was thick with the impending sense of loss. Then, a movement. The line of villagers parted, and Alara walked through. She wore a simple blue dress, her face a mask of quiet resolve. She didn't look at Harrison or the other men. Her focus was entirely on the pasture beyond the gate. Her father started to move toward her, to stop her, but Lorenzo put a hand on his arm. "Let her," the old man whispered. "This is her story to finish." Alara unlatched the gate and slipped inside, closing it gently behind her. She walked to the middle of the field, where Magnus stood, watching the proceedings with an uneasy stillness. She didn't touch him, didn't signal him. She simply sat down in the grass, a few feet from him, and looked back at the men at the fence. Her eyes, clear and steady, found Mr. Harrison's. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then patted the ground beside her, an open invitation. Then, with a look, she gestured to Magnus, and then back to the empty space beside her. The invitation was not for her, it was for him. Harrison scoffed, annoyed at the theatrics. "This is absurd," he muttered. But something in the girl's unwavering gaze, in the absolute faith of her gesture, held him. The entire village was watching. Perhaps to prove his point, to show them all the beast's true nature, he gave a curt nod. "Fine. Let's see your monster." The gate was opened again. Magnus, who had been agitated by the crowd, tensed. His head came up, a low rumble starting in his chest. The villagers held their breath. This was the moment of truth. Magnus looked at the open gate, at the tense faces of the men. Then he looked at Alara, sitting peacefully in the grass. He took a step, not towards the freedom of the open gate, but towards her. He walked to her side, his movements slow and deliberate, and with a soft sigh that seemed to drain all the tension from his body, he folded his legs and lay down beside her. He rested his massive head in her lap, his eyes closing in utter contentment. A profound silence fell over the crowd. It was an argument more powerful than any speech. Harrison stared, his jaw slack. He saw not a liability, not an asset, not a line item on a risk assessment report. He saw a relationship. He saw a love so pure and unconditional it defied explanation. He witnessed the peace that words could never, ever describe. The cold, cynical armor he wore every day cracked. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, and to his own profound shock, his eyes began to burn. He turned away, unable to watch any longer, and walked back to his car without a word. He tore up no papers, made no grand speech. He simply left. The stock trailer followed. The battle had not been won with shouts, but with silence. In the end, it was a girl who could not speak, and a bull no one could tame who taught a world obsessed with noise the one truth that matters most. Some things cannot be explained. only witnessed. Some fences are not broken down with force, but dissolved with presence. Have you ever considered what walls in your own life might fall, not with more words, but with the simple, courageous act of sitting beside them in silence?